What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoner's Rift Team's live pod, and I'm here to talk to you about patch 25.5. This is the patch of the first major international tournament of the year, first stand, and so it is going to be somewhat of a pro-focused patch. Let's go into the table of contents for this video. There is a big set of systems changes to try to kill lane swaps in pro play. We'll talk about that somewhat at length. We're also doing some further under-the-hood calculation updates to Atakhan's spawning logic, also aimed at pro play. We're doing a bunch of systems balance, mostly tuned actually for solo queue, and some champion balance, which is a mix of pro-focused and solo queue-focused champion changes. Alrighty, so let's talk about the fact that we are doing a big change to try to get rid of lane swaps. There are a lot of ways the project could have gone. Some of it is constrained by the time frame we've got. Ultimately, we have not been spending 10 months being like, how do we remove lane swaps from pro play? It's been basically just several short-term discussions and development cycles, and we haven't been like, again, spending a large amount of time being like, how do we do this in the best way, in the most rigorous way, in the best telegraphed way? It's been not a whole lot of development time, right? So kind of want to point that out, that we haven't been like working at this for the better part of a year. But one thing I want to say is that I think it is important that League of Legends, when you watch the pro game, it looks like the game you play at home, even if you're not as good as those players. You know, if you're watching like a shooter, like they hit shots you could never hit, the fact that they're, you know, the same team practicing together for a year and that they're more coordinated, but you could do that eventually, right? It's just the game but better, the game but higher skilled. I think that works really, really well. Like that is a positive thing for the esport. That breaks down when the fundamental gameplay looks really, really different. And so, for example, having these 2v1 top lane swaps, or the really older versions that were 4v0 where you just traded towers or whatever, that was so far from regular League of Legends gameplay that it just doesn't look like the same game. And I think it's actually important that it looks like the same game. And so some of you may be like, hey, I really enjoy the strategic depth there. And to be fair, there is some strategic depth to doing lane swapping. But ultimately, as a spectator sport, League of Legends probably shouldn't have significant lane swapping on it. Some of this is sort of long-term trickle-down stuff, like, hey, you should send your AD carry to mid at a certain point. Hey, you should rotate toward grubs, and as you get better at the game, you do that as well. But to me, basically, Challenger solo queue and pro play should look closer to what it should look closer together than what it does now. Again, coordination skills, all that very, very relevant, but in terms of like actually seeing Riven outplay another top laner, that exists in Challenger and basically doesn't exist in pro play. So that's a very short version of the logic for why we're doing this, but again, I think it's correct for us to do this. Anyway, one reason why regular players send 2 people to bot lane, 1 to top lane, 1 to mid, etc., and for a lot of League of Legends lifetime, it's been true in pro play as well, is map asymmetry, right? There isn't any other intrinsic reason why you would go bot lane versus top lane unless there is a reason to be in top lane. And over the passage of time, that has become less and less important. The map has become less and less asymmetrical. Void grubs existing, for example, is a new thing, and that was done to give some more agency to top lane, to give winning top lane the ability to have that advantage spill into the objective game, as we tend to like League of Legends being a moderate amount about objectives. Maybe the tuning's off, that's fine, you can make that point, but that is why Void grubs existed, and why it exists initially at 5 minutes into the game. And so as the map becomes less asymmetrical, or just more symmetrical, well, there's no intrinsic reason why you should be in bot lane with all your resources instead of top lane. And so the discussion was like, well, do we want to rebuild baseline map asymmetry? Do we want to push grubs out? Do we want to make Dragon more powerful? Do we want to make bot lane more important by giving that tower 10 plates and making minions worth more gold and the turret worth more and all these things? And what we kind of settled on pretty quickly was, no, we don't actually want to put that much more power into the bottom side of the map, because now, what do you do when you play bot lane? You get TP'd on constantly, the jungler only goes here, top lane is an island, but it's an island that doesn't matter. Okay, the outputs there aren't very good, the outcomes there aren't very good. Okay, real baseline asymmetry is probably not the way we're going to go. Okay, well, what else can we do? Well, we can essentially just enforce the gameplay. And we can enforce it in ways, so there's then 2 ways we can do that, right? broadly speaking, there's two ways we can force just be in bot lane. Again, through the lens of asymmetry. You can say, well, actually, bot lane rewards there being two people, and top lane rewards there being one person, or punishes there being two people. And so, okay, through that lens, what's possible? Well, we could spawn unique minions per minion wave, or create special rules around in bot lane they share XP differently, and all these kinds of things. It's like, well, we could do that, but also, in this case, we're on a pretty tight timeline, and so actually creating new minions and designing new rules and all that stuff just not going to happen in the time frame we were doing this work in. And so I think there's totally a world where each lane has a unique array of minions, and those minions have unique rules around them. Now, how do players learn them? I'm not sure. It's solvable, I'm sure, but it's not obvious at the very start that, like, well, of course you should send people to bot lane. Look at the minions there. And then what about brand new players who don't jungle and they send people to top lane? Do we have to account for that? Like, there's a lot to solve, right? And so, though there is something compelling around there being innate map differences that reward two people in bot lane, one in top, etc., that just wasn't feasible at this time frame. And so we said, well, that's a cool idea, but not for this. And so what we came down to, ultimately going through all the options, one of them, by the way, was also tell pros they can't and enforce it with the referee. We thought that wasn't really going to be tenable either, but it was on the table. We discussed it briefly. I don't think there's anything else super important to talk about. Right, went through, changed the base game rules to incentivize it. That didn't really fly. Didn't have the timing or resourcing to like functionally change laning dynamics. That wasn't going to work. Decided not to go for a rulebook, and so we said, okay, well, what about just creating some game rule that will just force you not to do it, with the understanding that we want this to impact the regular game as little as possible. Since regular players don't do a lane top, not a huge deal, right? So we went for that. We went for vaguely that level of strategy, that kind of strategy. Our target for first stand is 0 games of lane swaps. The initial pitch was 1%. I think it's fine. It happens literally 1 game per tournament. So we're not going to like literally explode your champion or whatever. We sort of started pushing more like we would rather have 0 than 10%. Like 0% than 10%. And so we started pushing pretty aggressively towards like the end of development of this stuff. But there were like the tuning was in flux for a very long time. Even I think on like Tuesday afternoon, I submitted a different tuning pass. And now because we're targeting pretty much close to 0% for first stand, we are willing to alleviate this if it's really disruptive for the regular game. For example, we can pull back a lot of the rules or pull back, the tuning on them. And if that means that for the spring split, a lot of, like, we have 10% of games have lane swaps, that might be more okay. That'll be TBD, right? There's discussions to be had around that one, but that is a real possibility. We can alleviate this long term, right? We also know, by the way, that these rules are fairly clumsy. We know this is inelegant. We know that we would rather have a better solution in place. This is just sort of the reality of the time that was spent on the project and the urgency of getting this stuff in time for first stand. But there were some discussions around how we do this in a more effective way, in a better way for the game overall. Nothing's happening right now, but that is something that we're definitely thinking about. So let's talk about the changes themselves, now that we've talked about sort of the why and the how we kind of got here. So it is conditional on junglers. The very first thing in the scripting is it counts junglers on the enemy team. If you have no junglers on the team, aka you're dynamically going to play 2-1-2, the rules are not in play. Nothing happens if you're a level 1 League of Legends player playing with your level 1 League of Legends friends and you're playing 2 people top lane. Nothing happens. There's nothing going on at all. It's completely all locked behind if I see more than one jungler. There's a second condition as well, which is if I see 2 junglers. We've known from watching pro play in the past that there's plenty of times where the support will start Doran's Shield just for lane prio. We've had the Doran's Blade stuff pretty recently, actually. And so we know that pros will be very, very willing to kind of ruin their support's income just to get an advantage in the early game. And so we knew that tying these rules to a support item was not going to be good enough, because they'll just start Boots of Speed, or heck, they'll grab Smite and buy Red Pet, and then at level 4 or whatever, they'll sell it and buy it. And like, yeah, they're down a Summoner. Yeah, they're down 300 gold for buying and selling the pet, and whatever the gold income they're going to get from their passive. We were like, they'll do it. We know they'll do it, because what we're up against is they have to lane against Renata Callista, and their top lane matchup is Cassante Vayne. You are willing to sacrifice 1,000 gold in your support if it means you not have to play Cassante Vayne, you have to lane against Renata Callista. So we can't tie this to anything on the support side. We're just like, we just knew from the start, like, there is no way that would actually prevent all the lane swaps. Even though it would tax them pretty heavily, it wasn't going to be enough of a tax. So we said, okay, it's conditional on junglers. Buying a second jungle item will account for that and be like, any 2 champs, screw you, don't do this. Sorry for any Ivern support Smite players out there. This means you're going to have some weird situations. That's really, 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 really rare. But hey, technically that's a thing that we know will happen in solo queue as a result of this. Sorry. But yeah, it's conditional on seeing junglers and things like that. The timing is pretty tight. It's between 1:30 and 3:30 into the game, and so you have plenty of time to invade. The first camps have spawned. The waves have already met by this point in time, and the area check is does not overlap with any conventional camps you would start on. It overlaps a bit with Gromp. If you're like preventing red team from lane swapping, when like you might proxy to do a lane swap, it's going to overlap with that lane into like the Gromp area. It's kind of close to Krugs, but it won't even quite clip Krugs or even the Tri-Brush out of the jungle. So we tried to be pretty good about the sort of area painting here to make sure that regular gameplay wasn't going to interact with this. And again, it turns off by first scuttle. So unless you were going to roam into mid as support or roam into top as a mid laner before the first scuttle spawn, this will not impact you, right? Again, your late invades are fine. Just don't go into the lane. But yes, if you're playing support Twitch and you roam into like invading enemy raptors and you path through mid, you're going to trigger lane swap detection, because Twitch support pathing through mid looks a whole lot like Twitch laning in mid, right? That's not really distinguishable, right? That's just not really possible. There are a lot of warnings though. If you walk into a radius greater than the detection radius, it'll be like, warning, you'll get a ping, you'll get a message like you're walking into lane swaps, please leave the area. If you keep going, you'll be spammed with this stuff. You will keep seeing this message over and over again. There is an icon on your champion. There is a buff on the buff bar. It's pretty overt. Hopefully players understand this and are able to walk back. We actually know from surveying players that around 70% of players are high context on patch notes. They either read them themselves or will at least look at the sort of Cliff Notes image at the very top, or will like watch a content creator go through the patch notes on YouTube or Twitch or whatever. There are a portion of players who don't interact with this. I think those tend to be lower elo. I don't have that correlation. I don't know if that's actually true or not. But again, the point is to be out of the way as much as possible so that most players won't run into this dynamically. We've play tested on these rules for the last week or so, and I don't see them ping. And like to be fair, like in exactly the place of like playing Bard, you might roam out of your lane a little bit early. We also know that like if you're gonna first blood your bot lane at level 2, that's gonna be at like 2 minutes and change, and roaming mid after second wave on Pyke will trigger this. And so we're like, well, we would rather say, sorry, Pyke, you can't roam mid on wave 3 or 4. If it means that they're not going to just, recall out a bot lane after wave 2, we just lane mid as a lane swap. And so we know there are direct trade-offs here, right? Explicitly, there are direct trade-offs between pro play and solo queue. This is the timing that we lined on that allowed us to impact solo queue as little as possible, while being inclusive as we thought was reasonable for what looked like a lane swap to pro play. After about wave 5, right, the first cannon, or after wave 4, the first cannon has cleared, wave 5 is meeting, that's roughly 3:30. At that point, you've clearly played out your laning phase. If it's Cassante Vayne, you've played it out for that long, all right, you're opened up, right? We're now past first scuttle, we're getting pretty close to dragon setup and grub setup, okay, the lanes are open again. All right, and that's basically the line we drew on getting out of the way of solo queue, and passing the eye test of, okay, pro play actually played their lanes out. Now, in terms of also not impacting solo queue very much, again, there's warnings. The bigger thing here is turret fortification is now locked behind lane swap detection itself, and so we have managed to pull one rule out of solo queue, which is that mid and top turret don't take half damage from anything anymore, unless you send 2 people there. Not only does it not last till 5 minutes, lasts till 3:30, but also it's not there unless 2 people there. And so yes, this means that ranged auto attackers in top and mid are stronger. It also means that getting your early demolish proc in top lane actually does something pretty good and gives you a plate. I'm really happy that we got to remove some of this, anti-lane swap, like kind of clumsy stuff from solo queue. No reason we really need to have it, but it was there because of anti-lane swap, right? And so trying to be less in the way. Now, I think on net, again, this is still more invasive than just fortification from before, but also clearly fortification was not sufficient by itself. All right, so as for the things that are actually happening here, if you've been following PvE updates, you already know, but there are several sets of rules that are meant to be varying levels of non-invasive, if we can help it, while still acknowledging that we really try to hit 0% in pro play. Okay, so if you trigger a lane swap, the defender is given perfect gold and XP from every minion that dies in the lane. The minions hand over their last hit. The turret calls the champion its gold redirect target. So if the turret last hits something, it goes to the champion. Which means like if you're support Twitch and you gank mid and you like do a thing and then run away, it's like, well, at least through this rule, right, we are guaranteeing that if you're trying to lane swap and deny the Vayne or whatever, well, Vayne is 100% getting perfect golden XP no matter what you do. You can zone her out to around 2,500 units, and she's going to get everything. 2,500 units, by the way, is like, you have to hard freeze, like, right in front of your own tower before Vayne isn't safe and, like, walks up on this. Like, pretty much it's fine. So, you know, swapping to deny enemy top laner, not going to happen. They're going to get perfect golden XP. They can clearly live under their wave, under their tower. They're going to be functionally undiveable. More on that later. They're going to be fine. Okay, so that's a very nice gold delta. That is something we think it's not enough to guarantee you don't swap, but it's something there to help push in that direction. I'm going to skip over to turret adjustments. So as mentioned, fortification is no longer a baseline thing. Fortification now is Lockpine lane swaps. Fortification is now 95% damage reduction. It is now impossible to kill a turret plate if you are lane swapping. It's not going to be there. Additionally, the turret itself will one-shot minions. So if you're triggering lane swap and you're trying to shove a wave in to try to tower dive, well, the wave's going to clear up very, very, very fast. They're still going to donate all the golden XP to the defending champion, so they're going to still get pretty good amounts of golden XP. They're going to be overall pretty okay here. But, of course, theoretically, you could tower dive, and so, wait, there's more. If you're in top lane, the turret will also one-shot champions. Now, if you are tower diving in top lane as your support or mid laner before 330, I'm sorry, that counts as a lane swap. Most players, even if you are doing like a, you know, wave 3 Lissandra roam, if it's not an actual tower dive, you can E-forward, you can root them, you can do all those things. Like, that champion combat is not adjusted at all. But it does mean that you cannot farm plates, you cannot freeze because of Defender Gold XP, and you cannot tower dive because the turret's going to one-shot you. In addition to that, the turret also is going to give 50% damage reduction to champions within 600 units. So if you are, again, hard defending under turret, you have to be pretty close to touching. It's center to center, so you have to be pretty close by. Again, if you're like laning normally, this will not affect you. The support has to go there, the mid lane has to go there, the AD has to go there, but top laner is going to be quite literally undiveable. The turret will kill every champion in one shot each. Okay, you're playing Elise, congrats, you can dodge one. You're playing Maokai support, you can dodge one. Cool, 5 turret shots then. This champ is still not dying with 50% DR, right? 50% DR, they're getting perfect golden XP from the minions as they're getting crashed in, and because the turret one shots, they are always guaranteed level 2 on the dive. So no, you cannot realistically dive even a Vayne or a Twisted Fate who's soloing top lane. It's just not going to be possible. They're going to be fine. I mean, as long as they don't completely Astro Grief their early laning, they're undiveable. They're getting perfect golden XP. You do not deny them. They're getting perfect golden XP, right? Mid lane, we think, doesn't need that rule. We don't think mid lane needs the one-shotting champions. We don't think mid lane needs the damage reduction, because diving mid lane is much, much harder. It is much harder to build a slow push in mid lane. The mini adjustments we made in 25.1 made it much harder to build up pushes. The waves clear faster. Yes, it's still possible to build up a push. Yes, it's still possible to tower dive, of course. But combined with the turret one-shotting the minions, and the mid laner getting perfect golden XP in that situation, we think mid dives are going to be very, very difficult, very hard to coordinate, and low risk for the game overall. And so, because we know that supports will roam to mid and will try to go for tower dives, and that is normal gameplay, that Leona walks over on wave 4 and goes for the flash Q, or Alistar walks over and goes for the headbutt pulverize, we are explicitly not adding any like real combat relevant effects into mid lane in an effort to not mess with regular solo queue gameplay, because it is normal to roam mid on wave 3, on wave 4 support. And so yes, there is a defender gold XP benefit. Yes, and we'll talk about in a second, there's an offender gold XP penalty. But most of the adjustments don't really mess with you when you're doing pretty normal gameplay of wave 3, wave 4, roam mid, try to gank with the support, thresh, blitz, whatever, right? It's still there. You're still going to donate some golden XP, but we thought this was kind of needed. And again, also, you know, your support roams over, you get the kill, you do whatever. You can't push the turret, you've got to go leave. The turret's going to be invulnerable, right? So yes, again, we know this has impact in solo queue, but at least for that, for the stuff that's kind of normal, which is going towards mid, less impactful, right? While still being enough to hopefully keep people from lane swapping in the mid. Okay, the final thing though, and this is the really heavy lever that we're basically using to say no, but actually 0% in pro play. I am very happy to cut this down aggressively as soon as we don't need this at 0%, if we're okay with 5%, if we're okay with anything else, if we are no longer okay with the solo queue impact. I mean, this is tuned to be micropatchable. It is a one-line change to make this penalty, not what a penalty is, and it's trivial to put onto the live gameplay. Again, if this is a really big deal, it's not hard to change. It's set up in a way to be very, very easily adjustable. It's all in one spot. It's pretty straightforward. But there is a very strong penalty to say, well, if you're doing this to say, you know what, yes, the enemy Vayne's getting perfect XP, and the enemy top lane Vayne is getting perfect golden XP, but she was going to get that against K'Sante anyway. And our top lane is going to be towered over, but you know what? K'Sante against Vayne was crap anyway. He's getting 0 golden XP no matter what. And you know what? Sure, they're going to farm turret plates on us, but you know what? It's better they farm turret plates on us than we have to interact with K'Sante Vayne and lane against Kalista Renata. So, you know what? We'll eat that cost as well. You can't dive K'Sante. Anyway, he's good at lane. He's good at, not being towered over. You're getting turret plates on us? All right, you know what? We're going to pay for turret plates, sure. But no other lane is actually going any worse. Okay, well, you know what? Screw you. You're going to get less golden XP while doing so. And so if you are dual laning in mid or top lane between 130 and 330, which is 4 full waves of minions, the tuning right now is you get half gold and half XP from lane minions. Specifically, the income that comes from lane minions is cut by 50%. This is obviously tuned very aggressively. 50% XP, by the way, means 3 full waves of duo XP does not get you level 2. I think you can get to like 51% income and not quite get level 2 off 3 full waves. Again, it's not like you can tower dive anyway. That's impossible. But it means, though, that okay, well, if we try to dual lane top to deny Vayne, we get to the 3rd wave, Vayne's level 3, your, like, Varus and Thresh are level 1, she's not that afraid of you. Like, yeah, 2v1s are still good, like, she's not gonna, like, kill you outright, but, like, your resource disparity is so large, you would have rather laned up against the Kalista Renata. And that's basically what this is here for, is to say, look, if you're doing it to protect your dual lane is more screwed than their worst matchup. Maybe your top lane is the same as it was, okay, fine, but your dual lane is now in a really bad spot. Hey, you know I'm going to do this. And I do think if this, by the way, was a 0% mod, if there was no penalty here, pros would lane swap in some scenarios to say, we're going to sacrifice 3 plates, we're going to give the top lane a perfect farm, which they're already going to do, but our bot lane gets perfect farm, their bot lane gets perfect farm, our top lane is K'Sante, he's going to live on our tower. It's kind of okay. And then, like, Jax is going to be kind of okay, and Maokai sometimes going to be kind of okay. And, like, there's enough champions where it's like, actually, they're going to survive that tower dive or, like, make it annoying enough. And we didn't, like, want to be like, we also want to make tower dives easier to, like, there are other gameplay changes we could make to say, actually, tower dives are easier, actually, turrets are worse at defending you. Again, there were, like, meaningful gameplay changes we could make. One thing we considered was removing the turret bulwark, where it gains bonus armor MR for a few seconds when a lot of enemy champs are surrounding a turret right after a plate drops. But we didn't want the ability to just like crush a turret plate in regular gameplay. It would have allowed the turret to always lose 3 plates in a lane swap, but we didn't want to do that. So that's the space that we're in, right? Those things that we're doing. This will absolutely affect some players in solo queue sometimes, and we know that. We're happy to retune some of these numbers as needed. I expect there to be a pretty big change ultimately in how pros draft, because suddenly the answer to Vayne K'Sante is not just lane swap, it's, well, figure it out. Maybe K'Sante goes mid and you play a different top laner, or you play Kennen or something. I don't know. That is going to be a pretty big relearning for pro players. Now, the actual gameplay itself is the actual gameplay, right? 1-1-2 is normal League of Legends. Not having a lane swap, as far as I can tell, is not only something that viewers want. They want to see regular lanes again. They want to see the cool top lane matchups. But also pro players, from my understanding, the vast majority of them do not like lane swaps. And so they are largely going to be very happy they can play the normal game out. Yes, it was very powerful. It was worth doing, but important to not have that in the game. I think they're going to generally have more fun without lane swaps in the game. But of course, this does mean that draft strategy will have to update. Draft strategy will have to change in this patch, because you can no longer lane swap against bad matchups. That has a pretty big deal. This will probably have some pretty long-term ramifications. We'll see what that looks like, but that's the way we're going with this. All right, on to much smaller scope changes. Atakhan rules. There were some changes, by the way, in 25.4. Specifically, the way that Atakhan calculated whether it was voracious or ruinous got updated. There was a pretty big project led by the seasonal designer who basically did final design on Atakhan in finding ways to cleverly track damage in interesting ways to allow pro play to actually get a decent number of voracious Atakhans versus ruinous Atakhans, while also having a reasonable share in solo queue as well. We added a bunch of data tracking during 25.4 as well. Only the LPL is playing in 25.4, but with that data, we were able to do some further numbers adjustments. And essentially, I don't remember what the exact goal is in terms of number of ruinous versus number of voracious, but if I recall correctly, the intent is more ruinous, which is the one that spawns flowers, than voracious, which is the one that's a GA. So in that both solo queue and pro play, the majority of Atakhan spawns are flowers, not Guardian Angel. From what we've seen in the LPL, we're getting pretty close to that one. Again, some nervous adjustments. We also know the LPL is the most fight-heavy region in the world. And so if the LPL is like 50-50, the rest of the world is not going to be that. And so, again, have to do some further tuning to get to where we want to go. Cool. All right, so now we're on to the live balance set of stuff. This should be relatively quick and straightforward. Let's talk about systems changes. We are nerfing Axiom Arcanist. This rune is overall a bit OP. It's definitely pretty popular, which is cool. It's good that there is a rune that people want to play. That is good, that is exciting, that is fun. That's all, really good stuff. But does appear to be OP. We are nerfing the damage amp by 1% for the AoE case, 2% for the single target case. We'll measure long-term, power level needs if it's still too good or it's not good enough. We'll make adjustments as needed, not a big deal. Next is we're buffing unflinching. This is my bad, right? I did the initial tuning on it. I was probably too reliant on win rate data. It really didn't look that bad, even though the math was, pretty cut and dry. This rune wasn't very good. But I was like, well, the math is one thing, but it seems to be performing. So I don't know. It's hard for me to say this rune is bad, but okay, as time went on, this rune is bad. So it's a pretty substantial buff. We expect this to be a more support champion skewed rune. The designer who did the buff here still wanted to have a small scaling buff and have the rune overall still scale a little bit. I'm pretty happy personally with 6 to 12. I think it's a reasonable amount of scaling for something like armor or MR. Just the way armor and magickas work, generally doubling at level 18 is functionally makes the rune kind of flat. If you're compared to something that said gain 6% damage reduction or whatever would be roughly 6 to 12 by level. That would be mathematically pretty close on a lot of champions. And so this means it doesn't necessarily fall off while still, keeping up with the game a little bit. Ultimately, obviously a pretty big deal. The fact that it's a relatively flat rune compared to something like maybe Overgrowth, where you're explicitly trying to be near lanes a lot and it keeps scaling, especially with other health purchases. We expect this to be a much more support skewed rune. And so, probably a decent number of supports could be running this. I assume it's going to be very good in certain matches as well, where the combat pattern aligns with being crowd controlled. This is, any Riley's champions that you're against, or something like Syndra, where you're going to get W'd or QE'd a fair bit. So just a straightforward buff to a rune that's not very good, honestly. Sixth Sense, we're buffing pretty strongly. It doesn't seem to be very good. From what we can tell, there doesn't seem to be a reason right now for the melee ranged mod to exist, and so we're removing a little bit of complexity here by just making it a flat cooldown regardless of what type of champ you are, and buffing the rune by, only 10% or so for melee users, but a really solid, 1/3 or so, 33% for ranged champions. We'll sit and wait and see what else this needs. If it needs a bigger buff, we can keep going. That's not a big problem. But for now, a pretty meaningful buff to 6 cents, as it's, really low pick rate and doesn't seem very good either. We're doing a buff to Yuntal Wild Arrows. Of course, is not the same patch that we did the Yasuo buff on. Yasuo seems to be in a pretty good state now, from what I can tell. But it would be cool to see Yuntal on more melee champions. Ultimately, melee champions have much less access to repeated auto-attacking. And so letting it stack at a, more similar real-world rate to ranged champions by doubling its stack rate means that you'll actually hit that max crit breakpoint at a more similar time. Now, some champs like Yasuo, if they have a good lane, get to Q and auto on cooldown, and they stack it really, really, really fast. But look at the user base. Yuntal has a good number of range users, has basically no melee users, and so here's a pretty easy melee skewed buff. We considered briefly doing other melee mod buffs, like should the cooldown be lower on melee, should the attack speed given be lower on melee, or the cooldown reef on the auto attack be lower on melee. For now, we're not doing those. If we need to do more, of course we can. Understanding that, again, it's harder to access this kind of stuff as a melee champion overall, but regardless, this is where we're at. Letting it stack a bit sooner, and so we might see champs like maybe Master Yi, though probably not. I think he's pretty far from wanting to do crit right now. Yasuo and Yone and maybe Tryndamere looking at this a little bit more often. Final buff is a buff to Staff of Flowing Water. August caught this actually yesterday and was like, hey, we should do this. I'm like, yeah, of course we should. Wow, really good call. I should have seen this. But Staff of Flowing Water has a 4-second long buff back from when it used to give move speed. We didn't want to give a 6-second long move speed buff, I assume. And when I made all the item adjustments to try to siphon move speed out of the system, which I still believe was a good thing to do, Staff of Flowing Water having a 4-second long buff made it really skewed towards champions like Melio and Sona, who can reliably re-trigger the heal and shield, and less good for champs with longer cooldown shields and heals and whatnot. And so increase the buff duration by 50% is a pretty meaningful deal. I mean, it really makes the passive 50% stronger straight up. I think in most cases that's accurate. Pretty meaningful buff here. Maybe the buff should even be slightly longer and be like really, really inclusive and really consistently hold your team up. But 6 seconds matches Ardent Sensor and is a pretty meaningful buff duration, and so probably fine. Ultimately, yeah, a pretty small buff, but something that is pretty, I think, deserving for this item. We move on to champion buffs and adjustments. So we've got some buffs, we've got some adjustments, well, an adjustment, and we've got a couple of nerfs. So Aphelios, we are still buffing the attack speed side of him. I am pretty confident we are okay with maintaining both attack speed and lethality Aphelios right now. For now, still, players are mostly playing lethality build. Win rates are looking relatively consistent, or comparable, I should say, between attack speed and caster Aphelios. Again, for now, I'm happy to maintain both as viable. It's worth noting that technically, just on the data, Aphelios, if you know what you're doing, which is roughly how we balance champions, is once you get to the I know what I'm doing phase of any given champion, Aphelios is theoretically balanced at when I know what I'm doing. We are basically giving him a buff to... this will probably make him, like, by the numbers, a little bit overpowered. I want to admit that. That's kind of true here. But Aphelios has been out of the pro meta for a while. We know that, sometimes it just kind of takes someone to remember to go. But even in Fearless, right, we're not seeing people go to Aphelios very often. And so, or, it's possible that Aphelios is meant to be slightly better than numerically balanced, have a higher, slightly higher win rate than numerically balanced. I mean, Taric is an example of this, where Taric's win rate is above what's numerically balanced, and I don't think anyone thinks Taric is OP. Yone is below the number of what's numerically balanced. Doesn't seem like people think Yone is a bad champion. Lee Sin and Ezreal are champions that are below what is numerically balanced. Doesn't seem to be a problem. These champions hold very high play rates and appear to be very, very strong. And it might be Aphelios that, Aphelios is a negative Ezreal. He needs to have a win rate that is slightly above what is numerically balanced, and that's appropriate for him. That might be entirely true. Again, I am trying to build out a worldview that I can basically consistently apply to all champions, and not be prone to favoritism, where I can point to numerical balance and say, okay, but based on what we know about what players perceive about power level, this champ should be 1% below, or 2% below, or 1% above, or 2% above what is numerically balanced, because of things like reliability or agency or power curve or whatnot. I keep thinking about that every single patch, about the things we put in, like, hey, this champ is balanced, but, numerically balanced, but appears to be weak. Okay, and I just keep trying to update my mental model over and over again to try to get to a good spot here. But yeah, so Aphelios is a champion that is dispassionately numerically balanced, doesn't appear to be considered a good champion, even in the hands of pro players who ostensibly have the practice on this champion. So we're buffing him. It might be that's actually his correct resting win rate is, 1% OP. We'll have to see. Next up is Dr. Mundo. This is a pretty simple change. We're giving him 27 base health. Usually 30 health is about 1% win rate. Mundo, of course, got weaker off of the recent Heartsteel, etc. nerfs, and so deserving of some power back, of course. My supposition here is that Dr. Mundo scales more from base HP than other champions, because it feeds into things like his E bonus attack damage and whatnot. If we're wrong, we can always revisit and give him larger buffs. It's not a big deal, but I suspect it's going to be slightly more than 1% win rate. We're pretty close to. Normally 27 health is not quite 1% win rate on the average champion. Next change is to Seraphine. Seraphine is a champion, again, who is technically numerically balanced as a support. She's also very hard for an enchanter. Her win rate by mastery is a much steeper curve than someone like Nami or Emilio or Sona. And so it might be that, there's just things wrong with Seraphine where she's not meant to be as difficult as she actually is, but is in this place. Maybe just power is in the wrong place to make that the case here. But it's technically kind of numerically balanced as a support if you're good at her, and also pretty close to numerically balanced in bot lane as well. Certainly much lower than she has been in years past, where she's been like, 3% mathematically OP, and it's been like kind of wild. We're like accepting of, 1-2% OP on mages and think that's kind of okay. But and we have room for that right now in Seraphine, right? So it's not a huge deal. So what I'm trying to go for here, I did the Seraphine changes this patch, is buffing the Q maximum damage amp based on missing health that only affects champions from a 60% damage amp to a 75% damage amp. Now, the logic here is that it is actually kind of wrong to double cast Q. Like, the best Seraphine spells to double cast via her passive are W is way up here, E is okay, and then Q is basically always wrong unless you're wave clearing. And usually a passive that says, hey, think about what you want to double cast here, and every spell has a soft synergy with itself double casting, right? The W saying it heals if you're already shielded, the E turning a root into a stun, or, you know, you have Riley, so it becomes a root on part 1. And the Q being like, as they lose health, you do more damage. Like, okay, well, let's actually juice that enough to make that double cast worth it. Let's make the power level of that Q enough to be worth double casting. Obviously, when you're wave clearing, Q is your best double cast. That's not changed, right? The wave clear has not changed here at all, because like that's already correct in that case. But in the champion teamfight case, it's clearly wrong, right? And so what if we added some back here and said, hey, let's make it better? I'm actually very keen to use lever some more. We think this will be about 1% win rate. There's some debate over whether it's bot skewed or not. I'm actually not sure it's terribly bot lane skewed overall, but it does allow Seraphine. One, I know a lot of bot lane Seraphine players like being a high damage mage and not just an enchanter, and so this does that. And two, it helps QMax be an appropriately powerful build, which it seems to sometimes not be the case here for support. And three, it helps the decision sort of choice structure around what you're meant to double cast by allowing Q to not be garbage in as many cases, right? Again, I think we can go harder here potentially long term, but my thinking around Seraphine Q and why this is the change we're doing. Next is a buff to Zed's E. I do think there's a lot of adjustment that could be done to Zed long term around things like haste appetite and AP appetite and things like that. But I do want to point out that I think people are correct in assessing that Zed is actually really, really haste skewed right now. That he really wants haste, and by design, haste is on fighter items, not assassin items. So you know, for what it's worth, a very large buff to the E-AD ratio pushes him towards trying to one-shot, caring more about long swords than glowing motes, and doing that. Now, is that perfectly designed? No, I don't think that's the case at all. But trying to push him towards caring more about the longsword part and not about the repeated cast part, well, that's a base damage versus ratio thing. And additionally, trying to not only go for scaling buffs on Zed. Mathematically, 0.15 AD ratio plus 5 flat damage ends up actually being relatively flat with game time. I think Zed could do with some more early game buffs. Like, I wouldn't mind getting some more early skewed buffs to Zed, but his gold scaling is already so poor on things like E that's like, well, we can't just buff base damages. It pushes him even more toward wanting to just build haste and scale and whatnot. And so okay, you know, we have to like kind of do both and try to get into the right spot there. And so I think there's, you know, again, more work to be done in this kind of space, but at least it's a nudge in the right direction. Right. The meeting that gives us buffs and nerfs like these is called reactive balance. We meet on Monday afternoon. We grab about 10 to 15 targets, and we get them done in the course of about 8 work hours. Right. And, you know, combined with, you know, researching what you want to change and what the correct magnitude for the buff should be, and sometimes getting a couple of iterations in if you want to keep trying things out, or if you ever have anything else going on in your time. Like for me, I was still finishing up the lane swap changes, so I didn't have time to go for several iterations for champion. Also, we care about risk. And so, like, yeah, we could try to do a bunch, you know, a 5-line adjustment to Zed here and incur a lot of risk, you know, getting the buff wrong, risk in being really OP or really underpowered or whatever. It's like, or we can just do one basically line of changes that I'm confident is in the right direction, doesn't solve all the problems, but moves in the right direction. Cool, good enough for now. And that's what will often happen. And then sometimes we'll spawn things out of that and say, well, we're moving in the right direction. However, we want someone to spend 2 days, you know, putting a few playtests in, or a few iterations in that we playtest and say, yep, okay, we think this has, you know, moved the needle even further. You know, it's 0% win rate adjustment, but it's moved in the right direction, and we're going to spend the design calories on that, the playtesting resources on that, and do that. That, of course, comes at the cost of other things we could be doing. But that's how the process goes, right? Anyway, next thing up is an adjustment to Poppy. The goal here is power negative on support, power positive in top and jungle. The last patch's Fimbulwinter nerfs were pretty meaningful to Poppy support. Poppy jungle's been kind of bad for a while. We still haven't really gotten her all the way back. And Poppy support is still a little bit OP. And so making some adjustments here. So Poppy's health growth, simply +6. Obviously, growth stats are skewed towards being in a high XP role. So pretty natively going to be skewed towards jungle and top, mostly top. Top has the highest XP role in the game. Next change is -20 flat damage on E, assuming a double hit. My assumption is that E's damage is a larger portion of Poppy support's power budget. And so she cares more about that damage when she's playing as support, has more room to maneuver and try to have this stuff going on, whereas like Poppy top cares more about Q's damage and jungle cares more about Q damage, etc. Also a 20% bonus AD ratio buff here. Now, this still requires 100 bonus AD to equalize the nerf. This is still a nerf to all versions of Poppy. If you're going to play Lethality Poppy, it's a little bit more viable than before. Congratulations. 100 bonus AD is not that hard to get. But we know that top and jungle Poppy tend to buy Sundered Sky, and so this is less of a nerf to those roles because they buy some AD. But I did not want to bump Poppy's AD ratio to something like 1.5 or 1.6, something like really absurd, because I don't think that's acceptable to have Poppy's best build actually be full AD. She's supposed to be a tank. It's fine with an alt build. I don't want to bring it to be as good. So still a nerf though, but not as big as this was a buff. The final change is stretching out her passive. This gives it pure linear level scaling. At level 1, it's -2% max health. At level 18, it's +2% max health, but because it's changed from breakpointing at 1, 7, 13 to linear level scaling, it's basically nerfed for 1, 2, 3, buff for 4, 5, 6, nerf for 7, 8, 9, buff for 10, 11, 12, nerf for 13, 14, and then buff from like 15 onwards. Now, to be fair, level 18 is often fake, so if you just like do the number line and compare green to red, it will look like a bigger buff than it is. But I still believe that basically pushing most breakpoints later into the game, well, the average jungle and top poppy are going to be higher level than the average support poppy, who's going to spend a lot more time levels 1, 2, 3, and, you know, at exactly 7, 8, 9, where it's still a nerf. And so that the expectation is that this is a support nerf and a buff, and if we're wrong, sorry, but a buff to jungle and top lane poppy. Now, this is, you know, the passive itself is a somewhat risky line. Like we know, health growth is going to be win rate positive and skewed to top lane. We are very confident that EDM is going to be a win rate nerf and skewed towards support. This one is a bit of a guessing game. It's something that I believed in. We're okay with the risk. And if we're wrong, okay, we'll adjust in 0.6. Now we're on to the nerfs. One big trend with the nerfs here is that we sort of realized that pro play was getting kind of dominated by a lot of recently released champions, which kind of feels bad. You know, in some cases, I think it is reasonable. I will defend this practice that new champs should launch at mathematically OP because everyone sucks at them. Like Skarner's win rate and Kassante's win rate right now, if you look at generic solo queue win rates, is like 46, 47%. Well, I know by the numbers, Skarner is like 1.5% overpowered, but people are bad at him, right? The champ is not, like Skarner Rework is still not even a year old, right? Came out March of last year, I think. So like this champ is one of the hardest junglers in the game, is still under a year old, and unfortunately it doesn't have a like Yasuo level of player base where there's a bunch of mains who like, you know, climb the Riven Katarina Yasuo mastery curve, and so it will take forever to have a mature player base that has a lot of Skarner mastery. You know who has that mastery? Pro players. And so, wow, they're playing a tank jungler who's 1.5% OP, and of course before this was like 2%, 3% OP. Yeah, of course, this is the only champ they want to play. Of course. And I mean, it's wild to me that it took them this long, but we saw by the end of last year, they're like, wait a second, Skarner's shattered. And yeah, he was, but he was shattered basically from the day he launched, despite the fact that, like, even on day one, I could probably go back and look, but I'm pretty sure day one Skarner was an OP jungler, but it was just easy to play Skarner top because all you had to do was mash W and max it. And, like, then people learned to kidnap and whatever else, you know, yada, yada, yada. But, like, Skarner top was easy, Skarner jungle was hard, and you saw that win rate difference, right? I know we're not talking about Skarner yet, but that's like an example of this, right? So anyway, defending the practice of new champs are allowed to be mathematically OP because no one has to play them. I think that is reasonable. I think that gets difficult when pros are able to put in the practice on time. And so the question is, how technically OP is the champion, and how much have the players caught up yet? Right? And that could be a tough question to answer. I don't have a good answer for you, right? We could say, no, we are unwilling to have any new champion be top 3 in role in pro, and that is going to be part of our balance strategy. That is going to hurt players adopting the champion because they don't have, you know, they don't get to go watch Zeus do well and like learn from that. But also they're going to have a much harder time trying to onboard because, you know, one thing to point out is that the average champion, the median champion when it loads into League of Legends, the player's mastery 7 on them, right? Which is like a couple dozen games. That takes a while to get there. And it's like, well, it's going to take you a while. And that's the winner, right? The winner is functionally pegged when you're like, hey, what's, you know, Twitch's win rate or Kallista's win rate or Draven's win rate or Ash's win rate. You're probably measuring the mastery 7 win rate, right? And so imagine the champ comes out and everyone's mastery 0. Like, how much lower does that win rate look like? And you know this, right? Like, you load in day one of the patch and you see like 43% win rate on Bessa or whatever. Or actually, she was 40% on day one, which I called. But it's like, you know, getting that, like, onboarding to that, right, is tough, right? Anyway, all this to say that there's this conflict between how powerful they actually are, which pros can access, and how powerful they feel when no one knows what they're doing, which I don't know how to solve that tension in a fair or clean way. I don't have an answer. Obviously, where we are now is a bunch of these newer champions, except for Mel, who's actually easy enough to play that she doesn't have this problem, right? Actually, players have an appropriate win rate on Mel because she's just not actually that hard compared to Ambessa and Cassante and Skarner, a little bit of Aurora here, because that's true. Again, that's kind of a delicate thing, a hard thing to balance. I don't have a good answer for you again, but here we are. Regardless, though, we are aware that, hey, a bunch of new champions are taking up kind of the top spots in pro play. We should do something about that. Let's take the nerfs. These are nerfs that these champions mostly deserve, either directly from just the dispassionate win rate numbers, or because they're a high agency champion, right? They look more like Ezreal or Lee Sin or Yone. Even if their win rate does not look technically great on paper, you watch them playing, like, yeah, this champ still, like, clearly looks and feels good and has high agency and doesn't, like, need the high mastery win rate to be an effective champion, feel like they're going to be a good part of League of Legends and go. And so, like, K'Sante's is this, right? K'Sante is a champion who, by the numbers, is, like, exactly balanced for skilled players. His win rate in, like, all MMR solo queue is, like, 46, 47%. That's balanced. He's balanced. He's just hard. But K'Sante might need to be a Yone or a Lee Sin, where he's like -1 from there, -2 from there, maybe even. And then that's balanced. He's going to be like 45% in all rank solo queue. And that's going to be like with the exact same power level by the numbers as Yone. Is Yone a bad champion? Is he weak? I don't think so. K'Sante could have Yone's win rate graph, but people are worse at K'Sante than they are at Yone. Sorry, like that. Have fun dealing with that, right? The funds of the fun part of players having access to win rate data, but not having the in-depth tools that we have when we're doing analysis and reconciling those two, right? Good luck. Anyway, the changes themselves, let's go. Mbessa, we're specifically targeting mid to late game squishy targeted burst damage. We do think it's important that Mbessa is a damage champion, that she's highly lethal overall, and we explicitly tried really hard to give her a lot of target agnosticism because we thought a lot of her power should be about doing well in the side lane one-on-one. And what we saw in internal testing was that, like, when you tried to fight against an Ornn or a Mordekaiser who bought steel caps and Riley's or whatever, like, those champs were unkillable. She could have the damage to kill Ashe in one combo, but she could not touch Darius. And so she has max health damage as most of the damage on her Q. She has passive armor penetration on her R, and through having both those mechanics, is finally able to be, like, appropriate when fighting other fighters. But what she does with this amount of power is she kind of one-shot squishies. If she lands R, she's basically guaranteed the full combo. R is pretty reliable. We know it's pretty reliable. We're not going to slow it down, probably. It's going to land a lot of the time. It reaches the farthest back champion, so it's going to hit the Ashe very, very often here. And say, okay, well, you should one-shot the Ashe less often when this happens once you get into mid to late game. And so this is the double hit damage of the E. We're bringing it down by 0 to 40. Now, 40 damage is not like the end of the world, oh my gosh, but like this is a meaningful amount of damage down, right? This is something that gets multiplied by Shojin, which is a relatively common item for her. So it is a relatively small, about 1% win rate nerf here for Mbessa. That puts Mbessa as like roughly -1% based on dispassionate data. That said, Mbessa is so mobile and so high agency, I think -1%, maybe even -1.5, maybe -2 is actually appropriate for her long term. As we play, the players get better at her versus Mbessa is balanced, and that as that dance kind of moves around, right? Next is Ashe. Ashe was overbuffed. We were going for about 1.5% or so. She got over 2%. The R AoE actually ended up being a really big deal here, and so we're just reverting one of the changes, which is the flat 50 damage buff on R. We actually think this will be like north of 0.5% win rate. Normally 50 damage on an ulti is not that big of a deal. In this case, I think it's actually going to be, because it's very low cooldown, it's actually pretty high hit rate, and it's very easy to hit more than one champion with the shot, which means the damage output there is actually pretty high. So we think that this, though this is a pretty small change overall, it will have meaningful impact. And also, I still hold the opinion that ultimates on a per cast basis are pro skewed, because pro is simply slower paced and tends to fight with ults up every time, which is not as true for regular solo queue. Next is Aurora. 2-part nerf here. We're nerfing the AP ratio of the E as well as the outer ring slow potency on the R. Ultimately, there's an interesting kind of dichotomy here. Like, the patchwork changes to Aurora a few months ago were aimed at making her a bit easier to access, easier to pilot, because she actually had a pretty strong mastery curve, and she was meant to be a bit easier to play. And so it was lowering a lot of the like move speed, like kiting optimizations, but giving her some upfront burst to be like a bit more straightforward to play. Just press Q, press E, press R, just like hit the buttons, congratulations. Now that of course does make her very reliable, right? It gives her a lot of agency because you just kind of one-shot you. And so we have to be, cognizant of exactly how much one-shot she has, because we know W is a good skill, we know R is a good skill, like we know she does have decent kiting because of those tools. So we are willing to pull down some of the late game burst because it's kind of high, right? The other side, though, is, again, the point about the ulti, where it's like, yeah, she really does trap the enemy team really well in coordinated environments. Presses the R, that's a slow. They try to escape, that's a slow as well. Can we lower the amount of trapping here, where she just kind of guarantees her team wins a team fight? And guarantees a hyperbole, right? Don't get me wrong. But lowering the ult-based teamfight potency, we think is something that's pretty pro-skewed, because by the numbers, Aurora is actually relatively balanced. Again, maybe she's supposed to be a bit under what numerical balance dictates, because she has Shaco Deceive on a ranged mage kit, and that is pretty strong, right? That's a good tool. And so, right, this maybe might be one of the champions where she's supposed to look a little bit more like Yone or someone else, where she's, minus 1%, minus 0.5, something like that. We haven't really made that declaration, but it might make sense in the long term for that to be the case here. Just a possibility, right? Regardless, nerfs to the tune of a bit more than 1%. Knock Aurora down as she's like top 5, I think, champs in pro play right now. Cho'Gath, this is meant to very directly address the very recent hyperspeed mid-Cho build. One thing I am a pretty big believer in, that I think there's a decent amount of buy-in in overall, is trying to reduce burst in places where it's not needed for highly durable roles. Because highly durable roles should be much more about repeated outputs than burst outputs, because that just doesn't align, right? If you're highly durable, you're meant to be repeating what you're doing. And you're squishy, right? You're playing Zed, you're playing full crit Yasuo. You're meant to get your combat, closed really quickly, and with that risk comes the reward. Right, with the reward of fast kills comes the risk of getting one shot and having to play around that, and that's meant to be the tension of playing, high damage Master Yi, playing things like this, right? Seeing like the lethality Trinity Force, Viego builds, right? They can get popped, right? And so having really high burst damage numbers on a champion like Cho'Gath, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense outside of R. Like, yeah, Feast has to feel good. Okay, cool. We can pull that out from other places and allow him to feel sort of more fair here. And so I nudged very strongly on the designer who did this, like, please, please, please lower burst damage on like the max ranks of the spells. I think 80 damage rank 1 is acceptable, but like these do not need to be 640 base damage on rank 5 Q plus rank 5 W. He already has Feast, like he has E, like please. And so the designer's like, yeah, okay, makes sense. Went for a mix of Q and W to not switch skill order. Cho'Gath has historically very often switched skill orders. Like, it was a good insight by the designer, be like, hey, if you just switch over to W max in the same champion, that's not good enough. So he hit both by 0 to 20. The most common skill order for mid-show is, I believe, QW. I forget if it's QW or QE, but I know Q first is like 80% of all mid-show games. And so I was like, I think Q has to be part of this, because at least you'll definitely hit mid-show, at least some with this. We know that nerfing Q rank up and W rank up would still hit top Cho, who's pretty much balanced right now. And so a compensation adjustment / buff is buffing the E damage right here. The base damage is unchanged, 20 to 100. The max health damage is buffed at neutral at champion level 5, buffed at champion level 7 and higher. Now, keep in mind that once you're level 9, right, 1% more max health damage is, right, 10 health per auto if a champ has 1,000 health or more. And every champ has 1,000 health by level 9, and so it's more than 10 damage per auto, right? So you're getting, call it 40, 50, 60 damage per spell cast on this spell, which you're clearly making up for on these, right? And so I mean, maybe we're wrong, right? Maybe the numbers don't quite pan out, but my expectation is pretty strongly that top Cho is neutral to maybe even slightly positive here. Understand that the fallback pattern of like max Q in a bad lane is just not going to be as good. But for Emax Cho, which is the vast majority of his games, I think it's actually power positive. We'll see if that's true. Again, might be wrong. But the current most common mid-show builds, which are QW max, are clearly lower. They're not only losing power in rank 1E, but they're also losing power in the Q and W rank ups. This might mean that the most common mid-show build becomes Emax. Okay, but then, mid-show who's not one-shotting nearly as hard, which is at least a gameplay experience improvement, which is a good thing, even if he does Halo Blades Emax, right? That's the move there. Next up is Elise. I know we have gone around and around and around on human Q damage over and over and over again. I am aware. Maybe this is the wrong line. I'm sorry if it is, and we add it back in 2 weeks, 4 weeks, something. But I still believe that it is correct to move Elise toward having a better skirmisher pattern. She should still be pretty lethal, still be pretty high damage, right? Not, giving her a bunch of health growth and giving her a giant shield or whatever, but to be highly damaging, but to feel more like a Yasuo or a Crit Yone than, just a LeBlanc, is where I think is directionally correct, right? This champion summons spiderlings to fight alongside her. She has life on hit. She has an auto attack incentive. She has an attack speed buff. Like, she should be doing some sustained damaging. And so in a patch where in 0.4, at least gained win rate in every single roll, she needs to lose some win rate here. I didn't think we needed to nerf W more. We could have, I suppose, but chose not to nerf W damage even more. Just said, okay, we need nerfs that will definitely clearly affect regular like support Elise. So we nerf her first max, we nerf the base damages here, which are going to affect, you know, hitting squishies, right? 10 flat damage is going to affect squishies, 30 flat damage at max rank. Combined is going to affect squishies, more is going to affect her ability to gank the Cassante in top lane or whatever is kind of the intent here. Lowering a bit of burst to make some room for the sustained damage to be more of her power budget. Again, she's very, very strong right now. I think by the numbers, she is OP in both jungle and support. And so in meeting of some changes here. Next up is Cassante. As mentioned, Cassante is by the numbers kind of balanced as a top laner, though his win rates look very bad. People are bad at him overall. But Cassante might be a, you know, the typical agency monster and need to be below that in win rate. Regardless, we're doing the nerfs partially for pro play. We know Cassante is a pretty big deal up there. We're nerfing his passive. The passive is losing 8 damage per trigger. The 1 to 2% max health is not getting changed at all, but losing some passive damage here. This allows him to, this nerfs him more for highly skilled players who are good at, you know, handling the passive well than low skilled players, and so it's a high skilled nerf for Cassante. It's also, generally speaking, an early game nerf, since the max health damage is going to overtake this long term. But in the early game damage, 8 damage in the early game, 8 damage per proc is going to be more meaningful, and so a landing phase nerf and a high skilled nerf, which should doubly affect things like elite and pro play. Other one is the damage amp here on the R plus W. I don't think this is actually a very big deal. I don't think it's a ton of power here, but it's another line on paper. It definitely gets to, you know, shed some of the eye-popping late-game burst that champion have access to, which can help him feel less oppressive in some cases, and so I think a worthy nerf overall. Next up is Skarner. As mentioned, Skarner is incredibly hard to play. He is by the numbers OP, but he's really, really difficult. Making changes to make Skarner easier will be hard to do, but we are, you know, considering making Skarner easier to play so we can bring up his performance floor. I think that is a reasonable thing to go for. But for now, right, Skarner is OP, and so we can nerf him, and that's going to be very reasonable. The slow duration on the Q3 being lowered by a quarter second, the max health damage on Q3 being lowered by, well, 25% basically, but, you know, from 10 to 8%, and then lowering or nerfing the E cooldown by a flat 2 seconds. Keep in mind, if you are hitting a wall slam, it's refunded by, you know, half-ish, I forget, but, you know, a meaningful refund there. Just overall nerfs to the champion, not much to say. These are what I think are fairly generic nerfs overall. We are not generally nerfing his durability. He is meant to be a tank. He should be tanky. I am glad we are not nerfing his actual durability. I think it's important that tanks feel tanky. But while they're tanky, they should one-shot you less. And so, hey, Q burst is down. Hey, he's going to pin you down for a bit less. He's going to be less likely to pin you down overall. I think all very reasonable. Finally, a very small nerf here to Yorick. I think there is more to be done here with Yorick overall. Yorick jungle seems to have an absolutely absurd win rate. Don't mind that there's weird optimizations and whatnot. I think it's generally okay. Maybe that opinion changes overall. This is not necessarily authoritative. Other people may disagree. We haven't talked about it very much here. But bringing down something that was very easy on a low sort of scope cadence here. The monster cap on Maiden being dropped from 100 per hit to 50 per hit. This is roughly 50 DPS when taking things like Dragon or Baron. Is that a huge deal? No, it's not huge. It has an impact. It's there. It does something. It'll also, you know, impact your hitting, you know, red buff and blue buff and whatnot. I'm pretty sure as well. I think the math pans out. That's true. But regardless, we know this is a pretty small nerf. Right now, there aren't great jungle-specific levers on Yorick. We should probably spend some time to add them and allow us to tune Yorick jungle. I'm, to be clear, happy that Yorick jungle is viable. I'm happy if players want to play Yorick jungle. That seems really cool. It seems like a pretty sweet second place to put this champion. I think that is totally fine. But we do seem to need some jungle-specific levers because this champ is incredibly, incredibly high win rate, and some adjustments probably need to be made to bring this down. This is probably not sufficient for this patch, but it's easy to do. It's the one jungle lever we have that is easy to put in, and so it's there for now. But yeah, long term, maybe some more work to be done. Regardless, that is going to be the video. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.